Last time I was working on creating all the data models and restructuring the game so that now we use data from a database rather than dummy data, since this is a multiplayer game. And I'm happy to say that that stage is now complete. So everything you see when we load up the game is pulled from the server. And we can also see that we have a loading screen now. So while the game is loading and initializing all the different systems in the game, it shows that loading screen. So while we're here, I'll show you all of the different working systems we have, at least on this map. It's worth mentioning that I am using Godot script to write the game. And since it's a scripting language rather than a compiled language, it effectively means that the only time you figure out that your code doesn't work is when the game is actually running that code. Whereas a compiled language will process all the different code paths when you're building the game, and you'll know at least that the code can run, like the syntax is correct. I mean, the code could still be syntactically correct, but be doing the wrong thing or making the wrong assumptions, but that's a different story, right? So in this major refactor that touched pretty much every file of the game to read in data from the database, there are, without a doubt, a lot of bugs that I find every time I go into the code and do some refactoring. So in this walkthrough, you'll also see some of those bugs. So as we go through these different parts, you can see our inventory still works. We can buy things from the shop and it actually applies. We can't really test the full functionality of these things because our inventory is empty and it actually pulls from the source in the database. And I haven't inserted any dummy data quite yet, but we've gone a long way just to get all of these interfaces to work again, to actually load in the data. And you can see there are some weird bugs like, why is this money changing every second? And things like that. So there's a lot that I need to go and work on, but there are some great things like we have the ability to accept quests. So things are still in a partially broken state, but it's just the reality of making huge changes to a game, and especially a piece of software that's written in a scripting language and you don't have a suite of comprehensive tests. So that's the data models completed. Now that I'm at this point, I've started looking at the actual data management. So creating, updating, and deleting data for all of the relevant player data. I mentioned before that there's over 110 data models that I had to create and integrate to get to this point. And since then, I've created 10 more, so we're at 120. But fortunately, the player data is a small subset of that. So I only have to make sure that there are endpoints to modify the player data, not the game data, of course. So this time around, the first thing I made was the chart for managing all the user data, just so I can get an idea of how much work there is to do, because 120 would be very overwhelming. I didn't want to further overwhelm myself if that wasn't what we actually had to do. And I think this part of multiplayer data is much more difficult than just creating data models and representing the data, and I'll explain why. Firstly, when we're dealing with online systems, although most of the time it works, you want to assume that it's going to be failing all the time, even if in reality it's only like 0.001% or something like that. You still want to assume that things are always going to be failing, and it's going to be failing for like the most important interaction that the player wants to make, because that's essentially how we build a reliable system. And it's impossible to have a system that will never fail. It's impossible. No matter how many backup plans you have, that's just life, right? There's going to be failures. So going into this process, whenever I look at each system, failure is always on the mind, which is fine, but it's also kind of stressful to constantly be thinking about that for every single step. So one of the first things I did is I modified the HTTP client, which is the thing that makes all of the different requests to the backend. I modified that so that we now have retry that are staggered, and we have different strategies for how many times you want to retry depending on the data that needs to be written. Because let's take the player profile, for example. Our player profile has many fields, but the fields that we want to change are fields like the time they last logged in, the current map they're on, their current position, and their current skill. And not all of these fields need to have a super high reliability of being written, depending on the scenario, right? What I did to make it less overwhelming is I made a table that tracks for each field what are the requirements of this field, how often do you want to save this field, and what will trigger this field being saved. So we have 5 different columns here. Firstly, we have guaranteed writes, which means every time this changes, do we definitely want to save this data? So how important is any given data point? And for last logged in, it's not really that important because it will largely be used to tell your friends when you were last online. And it will also be used to tell you when last you were online and to figure out how much experience you gain if we're going to go the route of making this an offline kind of idle game where you can get credit for things your character was doing even though you were offline. But you can see the next column, we want to at least write the final data of that field. And the reason we'd want to know that is because we definitely want to have an accurate representation of when you were last online, because we don't want to give your character too much credit. Like, let's say your character was online for 60 minutes and all of the periodic updates that we had to save your last logged in time failed, and so did the last one. That would be a huge issue because you would gain experience for all the things that you did during that time. And when you logged back in, we would also count that time as idle time. So you'd kind of gain double experience, which is not a huge issue, but you can see how that kind of vulnerability in the system would be exploited. And thirdly, we track whether each field needs to have instantaneous updates. And this essentially means that it's critical for us to have an up to date copy of, so nothing on the profile falls under this criteria. But if we were managing data like the user's current money or gems, you'd see here that we always want to make sure we have an accurate representation of that data because we don't want to get into a position where the user can spend more money than they have. Although it wouldn't be a huge problem, obviously, because it's just a game. But the significance of needing instant updates and needing successful writes is that we shouldn't let the player continue on if the game is in a state where it can't accurately write that data. So in this kind of scenario, you'd want to be upfront with the player and tell them like, hey, something failed, please retry. Or in the worst case scenario, you'd say something like, hey, that system is down right now, it's not working. But in comparison, let's say that your game is saving the last logged in time. You wouldn't necessarily need to tell the player if something failed because you would just update it the next periodic update. It would largely become a problem when you've have several failures in a row, and that would be an indication of that server just having issues. And moving on, the next criteria we're checking is, does this field need periodic writes? And this is for data that we want to track. We don't need a super accurate reading of the field. So we wouldn't want to track it like every second, every millisecond or something. This can be a tricky thing to figure out because you could say like, oh, shouldn't we just write all of the data periodically just to make sure we've saved it? And that's one approach, but server resources are not infinite. They're especially not infinite for me. So you want to be somewhat sparing with what you write and how much data you're sending across systems because it's all well and good to periodically write data for a user, but once you have tons of users, that's a lot of additional load you're putting on your systems. And another con with periodic writes is, let's say you're in a scenario where the user's money is changing because the user just purchased something. You don't want to also be periodically writing the money because you don't know the order in which the data will be written. So you could accidentally overwrite the user's money with more money than they actually have, and vice versa because you're doing periodic writes. And there are some ways to kind of resolve that problem, like if you were to save the time that the request was made, but that just adds a lot of complexity to your system. And there are scenarios where that would not even work. Like, let's say that you're on the town map, which is on one server, and that server is having a bit of issues. So its periodic updates are still stuck in the retry modes. And let's say you can retry 10 times, but you would retry 10 times over the period of 5 minutes or something. Let's say that user now goes to a different map and that map's server is not really having many issues. Then you have two separate servers that don't know about each other's requests, and those servers could have clock drift. And that's essentially when a time on a computer, which is a server, gets out of sync with the universal time. And every single computer in the world has clock drift of some sort, but some computers can get into a state where the clock drift is extreme. And when you have hundreds of servers, this becomes an issue. And it's even an issue on a smaller scale because you never know the quality or the accuracy of the time on the computer that your server happens to be running on. So yeah, you can kind of see what I'm talking about when I mention that it becomes stressful and kind of overwhelming to think about these failure scenarios and kind of how paranoid you have to be when building large systems. Hopefully I explained that example well. So moving on from that headache, the final thing I'm tracking is the server going to be bulk writing this field? That essentially means one of two things. The server could bulk write because it's doing a periodic save of all of the players that happen to be connected to that server at that time. But it could also bulk write because it's saving the actions of multiple players and then writing that data later on so that we're making less requests to the database in the back end, and thus we're putting less traffic on these systems, and thus I need to buy less resources, less systems, which is great, right? So those are all the things that I'm tracking to make sure that I'm building a system that makes sense for each feature. And I'm considering the process of categorizing and thinking about the reliability of each field to be the design stage. Now going to the table where we track all of these things, we have about 1.5 charts worth of work to do. But even though there's much less in number of things to do, each step feels a lot more cognitively intense. I think especially because it doesn't feel good to think about everything failing and going to crap and think about all the ways that you don't know that it could go to crap. This is probably one of the cons of having been a site reliability or production engineer before. I'm very, very aware of the novel ways that production systems have failed before. But I'm also trying to keep in mind that I'm not building something that's life critical. So I just need to do something that is good enough. It deals with failure states, does its best to resolve it, but otherwise, it's honest with the user and doesn't leave the user stranded in a way where they've done a lot of work and that data is just lost. So yeah, that's where we're at. I've implemented data management for the player's profile. So we do have periodic updates working. And we also update the data whenever they change skill, position, map. So getting to that point took a lot of energetic and mental hurdles. But I do think now that I figured out one of the systems, it'll be much easier or much less intimidating to figure out the other ones because I have built in the infrastructure to do retries. I know how to do the bulk writes and do all of those things for the server rather than the player's client. As I've mentioned in the last video, just to prevent cheating. So I do know that these things are possible. I think now, especially that I spent a month or two, working on multiplayer, during the time it's been quite challenging, either because the concepts themselves are challenging or just the sheer amount of work to go through is challenging as well. Because it takes energy, right, to continue onwards. And yeah, we have gotten to a really good place. I'm glad to have made this progress, but I definitely feel the onset of crispiness, the kind of like I need a break kind of feeling. So I think this upcoming week, I will take a break. I will take some time just to slow down, to recuperate, to shift gears a little bit and not think about this at all. So I can come back and be enthusiastic to work on this new stage. Even just forgetting the game for a moment. During these past couple of months, I have been challenging myself in other ways in life. Like I have been trying to build a community, which means trying to make new friends. I'm definitely not the first one to say this, and I will not be the last, but it's extremely difficult to make friends for tons of different reasons. A few being that people are afraid of rejection, don't really want to put themselves out there, don't really have the time or the discipline to actually respond to people or feel inconvenienced by other people just a little bit. A lot of people seem to have given up, but I haven't. A lot of people seem to have given up on the pursuit or kind of doing like a half measured approach where they're taking like a week to respond to things. So that's also been a lot of wading through not great experiences. And I think, especially nowadays, I've gotten to the point where I only want to make reciprocal meaningful friendships. So it's also pretty difficult to find people that you are able to have that kind of relationship with. And in order to find that on my end, I also have to be myself, not put on a socially acceptable mask for what I think most people would like. So the experience of going out there as yourself and not being able to find connection, not necessarily because of you, but just because of where people are at and just the natural fact that not everyone's going to be compatible. All of that can feel kind of stressful and feel a bit like rejection as well. That being said, I have managed to find at least one more friend that could be lifelong worthy. And those kind of relationships are priceless. So yeah, I think in order for me to live this kind of holistically fulfilling life while also being productive, I need to acknowledge that if we think about it like a game, I've been collecting stacks of debuffs from either social rejection or just the negativity of thinking about the failure stage and the amount of work that I need to do. And it'll be good to take a break to kind of clear those down a bit. Beyond that, my next goal will be to finish the whole data management chart and to make sure that everything's working again. I hope that will only take another 2-week block. But given that I want to add a little bit of life and recovery flexibility, I will be back with the next update once the chart is done. As usual, thanks for taking the time to watch. Subscribe if you'd like to continue following these game development updates, and I will see you next time with this data completed.